Once upon a time, long, long ago, there was a terrible famine in Israel. A farmer named Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons lived near Bethlehem in Judah. Things got so bad in that region that Elimelech decided to take his family to the far-off country of Moab, where food was known to be abundant. This was an extremely bold move, since the Israelites and the Moabites were sworn enemies. But Elimelech was desperate. Unless he did something, his family would surely starve. So this is how Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons came to leave their home in the land of Israel and go to live in Moab. Now life was hard there too, but they were able to build a simple home and scratch out enough food to eat. But then tragedy struck again. Elimelech got sick and died, leaving Naomi to raise her 2 sons alone in a hostile land. Well, Naomi was a strong woman. Despite poverty and hardship, her sons grew to manhood and eventually married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After 10 years or so, the young couples were still childless. So, when sadly both of Naomi's sons were killed, presumably in conflicts with neighboring Moabites, their wives moved in with her. So now the 3 women, Naomi, the mother-in-law, and Ruth and Orpah, the daughters-in-law, were on their own. Losing her sons was the final straw for Naomi. It was just too much for her to bear. So she decided she had to go home to Bethlehem. And she advises Orpah and Ruth, whom she's come to love very dearly, to return to their Moabite families where they would be safe and able to find new husbands of their own nationality to take care of them. Besides, she tells them, Moabites are still quite unwelcome in Judah. Orpah definitely sees the wisdom in this and returns to her parents' home, but Ruth, declaring her undying loyalty to Naomi in one of the most beloved and touching passages in the scripture, says to her, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." So Ruth goes with Naomi back to Bethlehem, where she is forever known as the Moabitess, or the foreigner. However, the sweetness of her disposition, her love for Naomi, and the diligence with which she does her work, eventually wins the hearts of Naomi's family, friends, and neighbors, and they embrace her as one of their own. Ruth and Naomi were happy living together, though they were still quite poor. As was her habit, Ruth went out one early morning to a nearby field to gather the scraps of wheat left behind by the harvesters. One day, she finds herself face to face with Boaz, the owner of the land. Boaz, being a kind and generous man, tells Ruth to take all she needs and even brings her water to drink. He is touched by her kind and gentle manner and soon decides to take her and Naomi under his protection. Before long, he proposes to Ruth, the foreigner, and they marry. In the warmth and safety of life with Boaz, Ruth, who has been barren all those long years, gives birth to a son. Boaz and Ruth name their son Obed. Now Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. And this is how Ruth, the foreigner, became a matriarch in the lineage from which Jesus was born. Jesus, the consummate Jew, had mixed blood. What a tremendous story. A political story. It's an inspiring immigration story. It's a story of xenophobia, prejudice, and fear, And it is also a story of love, devotion, courage, and acceptance. You may remember that the Israelites thought of themselves as God's chosen people. They thought themselves special in God's eyes, better than their Arab neighbors. This chosen people idea has had an enormous impact on both Jewish and Christian culture. The story of Ruth and Naomi, though written over 3,000 years ago, has never been more relevant than it is today. I wonder how many of us retain deep down vestiges of the idea that there is a chosen people, and that we, especially if we're American, white, Christian, and heterosexual, are it. I wonder, how could we not? The chosen people idea is as old as time itself and deeply embedded in our culture. But that does not make it the truth. So Ruth's story, that of a foreigner, and thus one of the non-chosen, who ends up not only prospering in a community of chosen people, but becomes the great-grandmother of King David, is a revolutionary one. It grabs our attention because it carries a huge message. That character and love are the measures of a person, not race or ethnic origin or sexual orientation. And that God loves all people equally. God does not have a chosen people. The story contains a powerful message about agape love, spiritual love that extends far beyond our own small circle, beyond our family, our friends, our nationality, our race, our economic class, or our lifestyle. Metaphysically, Israel represents spirituality, and Moab represents materiality. The story teaches that when there is a dark night of the soul, famine in Israel, if we leave our spiritual path and turn to the material world, Moab, for relief, we may find temporary comfort. But it will not last. Naomi, who represents the soul, eventually loses everything that matters to her, represented by her home and her husband and her sons. When we seek to soothe our spiritual pain by immersing ourselves in material stuff and pleasure, we may find temporary relief, but eventually we will find ourselves feeling even more separate and alone. And we run the risk of losing our very souls and becoming spiritually destitute, alone and impoverished in a foreign land. And who is Naomi's rescuer? Ruth, who represents the beauty and power of human love. Remember, Ruth had the opportunity to return to her family of origin where she would be with her own kind, safe and secure. But instead, she chooses to stay with Naomi, her soul, no matter where it might lead her. By doing so, she and Naomi end up finding prosperity, comfort, and safety. Many of us, if you're anything like me anyway, have thought from time to time that we would find relief from our discomfort in material things. And perhaps for a time we did. At the very least, we found a few moments of forgetfulness. But at some point, the things we acquired or accomplished simply did not do it for us anymore. So we began to search for something more, something we could not even name. For those of us in this room, the search led to unity. We did not know at first that we'd been set upon a path of spiritual growth, profound transformation. All we knew is that we wanted to feel better. So we studied unity principles and practiced them to the best of our ability, and despite challenges and setbacks, life eventually got richer and easier. We made new friends and formed deeper relationships, became connected to a community where we felt loved, and discovered within ourselves greater power, creativity, and strength. All of this was very good. But you know what? Even that was not enough for us. Sooner or later, we became restless once again. Life was calling us to reach even higher. But what is that something greater that insistently whispers inside us? Perhaps the Naomi within us is calling us to merge with the Ruth inside of us. Perhaps our souls are calling us to expand our capacity for love. We human beings come into this life with a natural desire to give and receive love. And unless some trauma or psychological scarring diverts us, we will love our parents, sisters, brothers, spouses, children, and friends. We grow and prosper in this love of our own. But eventually, we reach a point where we're called to love people who are not like us and live in a consciousness of undifferentiated, non-specific, ever far-reaching love. We're called to love as a principle. And this love inevitably takes us, as it did Ruth, far beyond the small, intimate circle of our own kind. Oh, we know that, right? We're spiritual people, after all. We're unity people. Well, I'm sure we do know it intellectually. But my question for us all today is, how deep does that understanding go? And how does it change the way we live and think and act? Lately, I've found myself drawn again to the study of Buddhist teachings. In particular, Pema Chodron's work on compassion. In one of her classes, she gives a powerful description of the human ego. She says that our ego is that part of us that is constructed to defend us from anything we perceive may harm us. Our ego wants to keep us safe. Chodron likens the ego to a lovely house that we build for ourselves. And inside that house, everything is to our liking. The temperature is just right. The smells are smells we find pleasant. The refrigerator contains only the foods that taste good to us. Only our favorite music is allowed to play. And here's the best part. Only the people we find most comfortable to be with are allowed to come inside. It's a perfect sanctuary. Sounds great. Come on, you gotta admit, it sounds kind of great. But there's a problem. Sooner or later, the food's going to run low, and we're going to have to go to the grocery store. Maybe even Walmart Supercenter, for God's sake. Or the money's going to run low, and we're going to have to go to work. Sooner or later, we're going to have to go out of the house. And when we do, we are freaked out. The noise, the smells, the irritations, the people. We can't stand it. So we go running back into our house, determined not to leave it again unless we absolutely have to. We stuff rags under the door to keep out the strange smells, and we draw the curtains so to keep out bad images and strong light, and we take the phone off the hook so we won't be disturbed, and then we say, but pretty soon, we find out that our lovely little home has become a prison. We can't live because it's too upsetting out there. We invite very few people over because almost everybody we know is irritating in some way or the other. Those we do invite are so much like us. We're bored. We're bored and lonely because our world has shrunk to the size of the little house we built so we could stay comfortable and safe. This, the Buddhists say, is what the ego does. It shrinks our world, makes the space in which we can comfortably navigate smaller and smaller and smaller. We may feel safe, but our safety has become an impediment to our spiritual, emotional, and psychological development. The whole idea of who is family, who is worthy of my love and care, came home to me some years ago. My father was getting old. I think he was about the same age as yours when I left for seminary. I had 3 other sisters there. They were taking care of all of his needs. Believe me, he had many. Sounds really similar. But my sisters were angry. And they said to me, "Seems like you're not even part of this family anymore, since you're now more concerned with taking care of other people's families than your own." At first this deeply hurt, but over time I came to terms with it, and I began to see that I was being led along a path where my love would no longer be focused solely on those I called my family. I knew Dad was okay. I also knew that his day-to-day care was not my calling. My new path would teach me to understand that your father is as important as mine. That loving your child is the same as loving my own. That my grandchildren's needs are no more important than the needs of the children all over the world. This path would teach me about agape love, which is inclusive rather than exclusive. So this was a great awakening, and it never left. Never again, for example, could I look upon images of suffering in foreign lands with detachment. Never again would I be satisfied to grieve only American lives lost or broken. I remember sobbing as I watched the bombs drop on Baghdad after 9/11, because I could no longer avoid knowing that the art, culture, and daily life of Baghdad was as important as life in New York City. From the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3. Then Jesus' mother and his brothers came, and standing outside the room they sent for him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and the one who was sent said to him, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside looking for you." And Jesus replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers and my sisters." Agape love brings us face to face with our prejudices, and we all have them. Oh, I know, we've cleaned up our behavior pretty well. We're a lot more politically correct. We don't openly reject people of other races, religions, economic status, or sexual orientation. And yet there remains in most of us a preference for being with our own kind and a level of fear of people we don't fully understand. The Israelites were terribly afraid of foreigners because they were afraid interracial marriage might happen. And if the races were mixed, how could they say that they were God's chosen people any longer? Sounds strange, but perhaps a shred of that fear remains in our 21st century psyche. We hold on to our identification with our tribe because we identify who we are through that tribe. We look at them and we think we see ourselves, and it confuses us deeply. Most of us find our identity in our social, religious, economic, ethnic, or family culture. We stick with our own people because being with them is like, now we know who we are. Which brings us to a profound spiritual dilemma. You see, the spiritual path is arduous precisely because it calls us to unhook from the tribe we rely on to show us who we are. You know, are we sort of like teenagers? Do you know how they are when they're afraid to stand apart from the group? It's like the worst thing that could ever happen to them not to be accepted by the group. But over time, if we truly want to grow, we've got to come to terms with the truth that our true identity has nothing whatsoever to do with any of those things. Family, culture, money, lifestyle. Our true identity, and you said it today, is the I am, the Christ within. The Christ is the core of our being, and it's the Christ at the core of everyone else's being. That's who we are. And that's what matters. That's what makes us infinitely precious. And that is what makes every person on the face of this earth the chosen of God. I used to teach a course called Nonviolent Communication to the faculty at the American Hebrew Academy in Greensboro. Late in the second class, I think, an interesting energy broke out. An older, very traditional-looking Jewish man complained bitterly that I was trying to force him to speak a language which he considered women's language. And he said, and it was based on the way a woman thinks, and it meant nothing to him. He said that nonviolent communication was an unnatural way for men to communicate. Underneath that, I heard him say Jewish men. Mm-hmm. In response, a new teacher, a young black woman, raised her hand and slowly stood up and quietly said something a lot like this, of course, my memory. There are lots of things in my culture and conditioning that could have held me back. I have had to step beyond many of these things to get into this room today. I am willing to continue to step out of those boxes because I believe that if I don't, I will not grow. And if I do not grow, nothing in my life is going to get any better. And nothing in this school is going to get any better if we don't all step out of our boxes. And the world is never going to get any better if we in this school don't begin by stepping out of our boxes. And then she sat down. Well, you could have heard a pin drop. I don't think I can possibly exaggerate the power of this young woman standing alone in the midst of traditional thinking men and women, this African American in the midst of white people, this young person in the midst of middle-aged people, standing in her truth the way she did. It was absolutely awesome. I know that none of us here means to be exclusive, but our upbringing and conditioning have left us with some degree of fear of the other. Fear that comes out a lot of the time as judgment. But stepping outside our conditioning to reach for a deeper experience of love has tremendous payoffs for us as individuals and as a community. As we become able to embrace, not just accept, but celebrate all people, when we grow to the point where we're more excited than scared about discovering the differences between us, our hearts and minds are going to open. Our capacity for love is going to expand. And when this happens, we will grow. And when we grow, this community will grow. And when this community grows, the word of unity will spread farther and farther. We'll attract people of all races, ethnic groups, ages, economic levels, and beliefs. We'll reach out to them and we'll get to know them, and we'll be enriched and taught and blessed by each one of them. In other words, we will create heaven on earth right in this little place. Perhaps we can't change the entire planet, in our lifetime. I don't know. What I'm sure we can do is create a model of this heaven on earth right here in this little town. We could strive to be like Ruth the Moabitess, from whom Jesus was descended. Through the power of spiritual love, we can become mothers and fathers of the Christ, nurturing the Christ consciousness in this church until it expands in ripples and ripples and ripples out into the community around us. Who knows where we mothers and fathers of the Christ will wander, or how many souls we'll touch and feed? Hundreds? Thousands? Tens of thousands? It all starts right here. God bless you all.